topic today is, as you have seen, is the question of Europeanization. That is the question, how do European policies affect member states' policies, the polity, that is the institutions, and the political processes. That is basically, these are the three questions which I will look at. And the questions which will be raised are, how can you conceive of this process of impacting member states' policies? How can you theorize this process of influencing member states' policies? And if I have a little bit of time, I would like to discuss some empirical examples too, which we found while studying European transport policies in 5 countries, that is road, haulage and rail transport. So first, let me say something about the general thrust of argument, because very often I think Europeanization is understood in a very simplistic way as a process of top-down influencing, as a process of homogenization, as a process of uniform shaping of member states' policies. Let me just say right now that I don't think that this idea or this notion of Europeanization is correct. Rather, what we argue and what we have found indeed is that the impact of European policies on member states' policies, polities and politics is differential. That is, the impact of Europe differs across countries as regards policies, member states' policies, politics and polity. So let me just first present, when I say Europeanization, what do I really mean and what elements, what components am I really looking at? And to give you just a very broad notion, the elements which are analytically useful to distinguish when you talk about Europeanization and try to analyze the process as such is that you look at the European decisions as such, which you're interested in this particular policy area, and then you look at the processes which are triggered in member states in the course of the transposition and implementation of this policy decision of the European level. And then, as a third component, you look at the impacts of this process, which can be analyzed at the level of the policies which are affected at the member state level. You can look at the impact in terms of the changed political and administrative processes at the member state level. And finally, you can look at the changed structures at the member state level in terms of administrative structures and political institutional structures. Let me just mention that this is, so to say, a view of the process of implementation of Europeanization which does not take into account the process of member states influencing European policymaking. That's a different, so to say, analytical perspective, which we did look at in another piece of work as well, but that's a different story and has to be dealt with in a different way theoretically. Here it is just to say we take the reverse view of how once European policies are in place, how do they then affect member states' policies at the 3 levels which I mentioned. And of course you would then ask, well, what's the difference between Europeanization and implementation? And I would think that Europeanization is a very wide notion, and implementation is, so to say, an element of Europeanization in that it looks at a very particular piece of legislation and follows its development through the mise en place, through the implementation process at the national level. So this process of Europeanization has been explained in different terms, in various theoretical terms, and there are, as has been said in the literature, different heuristics, different modes of understanding what's going on in the process of Europeanization. And you can try to understand these heuristics in terms of causal arguments linking independent and dependent variables, when you then indeed try to explain how European policies influence member states' policies and structures. And in a very rough sense, you can distinguish the following different exploratory approaches. Again, you would have first one actor-based institutionalist approach, which has been developed by the Köln Max Planck Institute, by Sharp and Mainz, where you argue that if you want to count how European policies are changed, are, so to say, transformed by in the whole process of implementation in member states, it is useful to argue that member state actors are to be understood as purposeful, goal-oriented actors, strategically interacting in a given institutional framework. And that's, so the claim is, that's how you can explain what, so to say, the policy results are then at the member state level. There, you could, the outcome of this interaction, of the implementation of Europeanization, can be at the policy level either convergence, a growing similarity between European policies and member states' policies, or it can be indeed a divergence too between European policies and member states' policies, depending on the dynamic of interaction between the actors which are involved in the process of implementation. And at the level of, if you want to, political structure, administrative structure, it can result in a gain or a loss of administrative power, of political competencies of particular actors at the member state level. From this actor-centered institutionalist approach, you can distinguish the sociological constructivist approach, which would argue in terms of the logic of appropriateness, as Olsen has argued, where you would argue that a member state would be willing to take on board a European policy if, so to say, the belief system or the mode of problem solving of the European policy is close to the mode of problem solving which is already in place at the member state level. So, so to say, a rule of appropriateness would be decisive as with respect to the question whether indeed European policy would be taken on board. There you could argue, of course, well, if the problem-solving approach of the member state is different, too bad for European policies, they just won't take it on board. But according to this causal mechanism or exploratory approach, there would still be the possibility of forming a converging view of how problems can be solved by having an element of debate and discourse where problem views are exchanged, mutual learning takes place, and then, if you will, as it were, on a voluntary basis, a member state takes new elements on board in terms of problem solving. Here, again, the outcome can be convergence or divergence. Finally, the organizational ecology approach argues that Europeanization takes place through mechanisms of either coercion, mimetism, or normative pressure. There, obviously, the prediction would be that convergence is the outcome if you have, for instance, the causal mechanism, the mechanism of mimetism, which means that there is a tendency to take on board what other member states are doing successfully. Now, in our own research, we have been working with an actor-centered institutionalist approach, and we try to account for the differential outcomes of the process of Europeanization in the field under study by using this actor-centered institutionalism, by arguing that European policies represent input which is given into an arena, the domestic arena, where then actors in the domestic arena engage in a strategic interaction about what the transformation of this European policy input should like, and depending on this very dynamic strategic interaction of actors at the domestic level, policy outcomes vary at the national level. So you see there is no mechanistic argument, and it's quite, you have to look at the process of implementation. You have to look at very closely the process of transposing, of implementing the European policy at the domestic level in order to account for the outcome. We do argue too in our work that if you talk about actor-centered institutionalism, you first would try to explain in terms of the institutional structure and see to what extent the institutional structure can account for the outcome, but taking into account that institutions are not deterministic. Institutions offer opportunities of action and they delimit possibilities of actions for individual actors, but they do not determine. There is a latitude, and this latitude of the individual actor, corporate actor usually, has within in this process is determined again by his or her preferences and or belief systems. So we have these are the variables we use in our explanation. And now in the context of this explanatory approach, we come up with the following hypothesis. And the hypotheses are starting out with a very simple first claim, which is that if the EU policy requirements are very similar to the existing domestic policies, then there will be little pressure to adjust for this particular member state. That is the fit-misfit claim, which you're familiar with, I'm sure. Then we go on to argue, but very often you have to see that European policies are rather vague and are only formulated as framework legislation, which leaves a lot of leeway for filling in, actually really defining still the precise policies which are to be put into place. Then obviously there will be a lot of latitude for the implementation process at the national level. And there will be little pressure from the side of Europe on national domestic actors to change their policies. But then we go on to argue that both first two claims, the fit-misfit and the latitude or non-latitude argument, which are closely linked obviously, purvey a very mechanistic view of Europeanization, actually are not able to catch the dynamic of politics which is going on in implementation and Europeanization. And indeed, one could argue to go as far as saying this fit-misfit argument is devoid of politics. Their politics is in a way left out, and what is actually going on at the member state level is not caught analytically. So what you need is actually to take into account the different political arenas of member states. And obviously now we have the problem that the arenas, political arenas of member states are very different. And the problem arises, how on earth could it be possible to account then for this process of transformation, of implementation, in view of the fact that you have a variety of different political arenas. How can you compare, if you have so many different political arenas, in order to account for the outcomes then? And what can be done then, and I'm sure you're familiar with this approach, the complexity of the different political arenas of the member states is reduced by using the veto player approach, by trying to gauge the reform capacity or the capacity to change of member states by looking at the number of veto players which are given in a particular political arena, as has been developed by Zibelis, as you know. And we do look at formal veto players and factual veto players. That is, we do not only look at, let's say, the need of a particular institutional political body in a process of co-decision in order to bring a decision about. We also look at the blocking power of, let's say, unions, that is, other corporate actors. And then the argument obviously will be then, the higher the number of veto players, the less likely, the smaller the capacity to change of a member state. But one has to add, of course, the number of veto players have to be engaged in one decision. That is, in other words, they are engaged in a co-decision process, and so to say, the confirmation of each individual actor is needed formally or factually in order to bring the decision about in the first place. Obviously, and the less veto players you get, the higher is your capacity to change. So, if we see now the claims 1 to 4, it is rather simple still, what we are arguing. We said, it has been argued that given a need to change, then we claim that the higher the number of veto players in the domestic arena, the less likely the probability of change of existing domestic policies. But now it has to be added that even that explanatory scheme is still too simple in order to catch the complexity of this process of Europeanization, the process of implementation, because it is not dynamic. It does not take into account that member states' policies develop in a particular sequences, in a particular rhythm. They have their own logics, and it's very useful in this context to conceive of Europeanization as it has been developed by Clinton as two different policy streams. The policy stream of Europe with particular sequence of policy making, and the member state policy making streams, as it were, with their own rhythm, with their own logics in time and their own sequences. And very roughly what we did, we distributed or separated this flow in time at both levels into pre-reform, reform, post-reform. So that you can do with about every policy area if you want to. And having these, this division into pre-reform, reform, post-reform, with two streams, and assuming that these streams can be very different in their speed of development if you look at individual countries with respect to Europe, then you have to come up with another, so to say, explanatory claim, which would argue that if you are, well, now I have to be a little bit more specific, that depending in which phase you find yourself as a member state, with respect to what's going on in Europe, the dynamic which is triggered in the domestic arena differs. To give you a very simple example from the empirical research is that in road college policy in France, France had already put a reform into place. France had already realized what Europe wanted from France. But still, strangely, European policy demands triggered a lot of protests in France. They triggered what is even called social movements, and indeed a lot of protests from the side of the unions, and indeed strengthened the unions in the domestic arena because of European policies. And the explanation is that France was already in the post-reform phase when Europe came with its reform demands. And so to say, France had already realized the problems of liberalization and deregulation, and therefore responded in a very negative way to the liberalization demands of Europe. Completely different situation in Germany, where Germany was in the pre-reform phase in this particular policy area, and Europe was in the phase of reform, demanded reform from Germany. What happened in Germany? There were two contesting parties, one pro-liberalization, the other one against liberalization, and the European requirements strengthened the pro-liberalization party in Germany and brought a very extensive liberalization about, and strengthened, if you wanted to, the road hauliers, so to say, industry, completely different actors as compared to French situation. So what the message, general message is now of this particular example is that if you look at the process of Europeanization, you have to go beyond the mechanistic fit of policies, comparison between Europe and domestic level. You have to get into the complexities of the domestic arenas, and you have to look at the domestic arenas as compared to the European arena in terms of time developments as well. Thank you very much for your attention.